Thank you, Kelly. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here, both in person and online. We'll just do a short roll call for the committee, and then we'll get started.
Senator Baldwin.
Here.
Senator Garou.
Here.
Representative Newsom. Representative Winter.
Here.
Director Nesvik.
Here.
Director Miyamoto.
Here.
Ms. Jess Johnson.
Here.
Mr. Jim Magagna.
Here.
Chairman Storr.
Here. Thank you, Kelly. My name's Liz Storr. I am representative from House District 23, representing Teton County. I've also lived in other parts of the state, Saratoga, Ryan Park, and Cheyenne. So I want to thank everyone for participating. I want to thank the committee for making the trip and being here, both our legislative members and non-legislative members. And also thank the governor for his leadership and the legislative leadership for appointing this task force. We've received, we are planning not to take verbal public comment at this meeting today, but we are asking everyone to submit written comments. We've received a number of them that have been really quite thoughtful from folks both in state and out of state. And I think that tells us that this has been an important issue for the public. And we're really trying to recognize that and that there has been a pretty significant outcry, public outcry about the events that took place earlier this year. So it's our job really to see if there's anything we can do to address that, given that the governor's office, the federal land agencies, and the Game and Fish Commission recognize that the finger kind of pointed at the legislature to at least take a look at our statutes and see if there were things we could do to discourage the kind of activities that were of concern to the public. At the same time, recognizing the need for predator management, both for wildlife purposes and for agricultural purposes. So that's really our challenge today, to do that. And I'm just going to kind of articulate, I think, what in an attempt to kind of summarize the public comments that we've had, so as to help direct us in the discussions. From there, we'll have Legislative Service Office walk us through some statutes, and then we'll really try to have a conversation amongst the committee, and we may even suspend the going through the chair bit just so we can have kind of a more normal conversation and talk among ourselves to do so. So I think just briefly, the paramount concern is of one of animal welfare and the practices that most people, I think, believe represent a mistreatment of animals. Such behavior goes against the principles of the North American model of wildlife conservation. And I think it's worth noting in particular 3 of those 7 principles to help kind of ground our discussions. The first is the idea that wildlife resources are conserved and held in trust for all citizens. Thus, everyone really does have a stake in how we manage our wildlife. And while this committee doesn't represent all interest groups, because we represent the entity as the state that holds wildlife in trust, I think we should endeavor to consider such points of view in our deliberations. The 4th principle is that wildlife may only be killed for a legitimate, non-frivolous purpose. And, exemptions are made for food, for fur, for self-defense, and property protection. But there are no provisions for amusement or recreation. And I do think that is an area that is certainly something that we are hearing from the public, is much of the concern that, however you want to call it, actions that may be grounded in the idea of livestock or wildlife protection, but are allowed to take place for reasons that really have nothing to do with either of those, as I think has been stated by many folks. And then the scientific management is the proper means for wildlife management and conservation, and thus our solutions should consider best practices based on scientific research as best we can. So the other concerns, I think, from the public can be summarized as just the concern over the lack of fair chase demonstrated by the behavior of running down an animal with a 500-pound vehicle that can travel at speeds much faster than an animal can sustain. Concerns also expressed about the possession of the animal and transporting the animal that's wounded rather than putting it down humanely. And then finally putting the animal on public display. So I think the concern is really grounded in what I think we all share as values: a lack of decency, a lack of respect. And so it's our job really to not to put predator management on trial, but acknowledge the laws, that our laws do allow for this behavior. And while we recognize that similar behavior is actually what many ranchers do use in order to manage predators, we also, I think, need to take a look at whether there's a way for us to perhaps discriminate in the law between different activities for different purposes. Finally, our statutes do recognize that cruelty to animals is wrong, but we also have this exemption, and and we have that exemption for a reason. So ultimately, our committee should understand those reasons and identify which of those continue to serve society's needs, and if any do not at this point in time. And out of that examination, I think we can find a path forward. So today's goals really are to identify the areas of animal cruelty we wish to address, and propose possible ways we may want to address them, while not unduly interfering with legitimate hunting and agricultural practices. We'll try to work conceptually and build consensus around, providing the necessary direction for LSO in order for them to draft some legislation that then we'll be able to consider. Once it's written, we'll come back together through Zoom and review that, and at that point make a final recommendation that we can take back to the TRW committee in September. So that's just an outline for kind of why we're here today and what we hope to accomplish. And I'll invite any other comments from the rest of the committee at this point in time. All right. Well, thank you. Director Nesbitt or Senator Guru?
I'm good for right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. All good here.
Okay. So I think with that, Luke will go ahead and ask you to help us walk through the statutes.
Madam Chairman, Kelly Lower, LSO. I'll just do a brief run through of the memo. So this memorandum pertains to several questions. The statutory history of predator management in Wyoming, what form of take is allowed for predator management, how predator take is regulated, the statutory provisions for animal cruelty in Wyoming, how they relate to predators, as well as what other states do for predator management. The first section pertains to the statutory history of predator management in Wyoming. This section examines laws relating to wildlife ownership, the definition of predatory animals, and the taking of predators in Wyoming. Concerning wildlife ownership, WS 23-1-103 states that all wildlife in Wyoming is the property of the state, and it is the policy of the state to provide a system for the control, propagation, management, protection, and regulation of all Wyoming wildlife. Additionally, Article 1, Section 39 of the Wyoming Constitution highlights the right of Wyoming residents to hunt, trap, fish, and fish Wyoming wildlife subject to regulation, as well as the duty of the state to manage wildlife. The definition of predatory animal has not changed significantly in the past 50 years, with the current definition including coyotes, jackrabbits, porcupines, raccoons, red foxes, skunks, stray cats, as well as wolves, subject to their classification as trophy game animals in certain areas of the state. Predatory animals may be taken in any manner at any time, provided permission is granted by private landowners on private land. There are a few restrictions concerning hunting practices of predatory animals, which also apply to all other types of hunts, such as hunting near public roads or highways, on private land without permission of a landowner, and with other game used as bait, automatic weapons, and with traps without proper identification. Predatory animals may be taken with the use of motorized vehicles, including airplanes and snowmobiles, as well as with artificial light and infrared technology. As with the definition of predatory animals, these provisions have not changed dramatically in the last 50 years. Section 2 examines predator management in Wyoming, outlining the various agencies and boards that regulate predator management or provide compensation for depredation. And Section 3 of the memo examines animal cruelty laws in Wyoming, looking at various misdemeanor and felony offenses relating to animal cruelty and specifying that predatory animals are excluded from animal cruelty laws. Section 4 examines predator management in other states. 3 states are examined: Montana, Idaho, and Colorado. Montana and Idaho manage predators in a pretty similar manner to Wyoming. No licenses required and no tags are required in the taking of predatory animals. Gray wolves are managed separately from predatory animals in both Montana and Idaho, with tags and license requirements for taking gray wolves. However, in both Montana and Idaho, restrictions that apply to hunts of other game animals do not necessarily apply to gray wolf hunts, such as the use of artificial light and motorized vehicles. A license is not required in either state when taking a predator that is attacking livestock. Colorado manages predators a bit differently than Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. Generally, predator management without a license is only permitted in response to depredation. Otherwise, a license is required to hunt predatory animals, and gray wolves are protected by the Endangered Species Act, and Colorado may only be taken when done for the protection of private property. That, Madam Chairman, if there are any questions?
Thank you, Kelly. Any questions from members of the committee?
Madam Chair, Luke Plum, LSO. I think Kelly provided a great memo that gives a lot of information. I'll just briefly highlight a few, I think, important areas. And I hope not to be duplicative, but as Kelly mentioned, Wyoming statute does define a predatory animal. Those definitions are found primarily in Title 11, which is the agricultural statutes, but then also in Title 23 governing game and fish. So yes, it does include, coyote, jackrabbit, porcupine, raccoon, red fox, skunk, or stray cat, and then under certain conditions, gray wolves. They are classified as trophy game animals within the wolf trophy game management areas, which are found primarily in the northwest corner of the state. But the vast majority of Wyoming, a wolf is considered a predatory animal. And so that's just kind of that special piece there. But really, truly, in Wyoming, predatory animals and predaceous birds may be taken without a license in any manner and at any time. And then, of course, within exceptions of just general hunting requirements. But just an important statute to note would be Wyoming Statute 23.3.103, which is where that language comes from. And really, when you're looking at this, as I mentioned, Kelly already kind of touched upon this, but I mean, no person can use, an automatic weapon to hunt wildlife. That would apply to predatory animals. They can't shoot across roadways or from roadways and those sorts of things. But that's just kind of the general hunting requirements. I think one important question for this working group, as was kind of directed by the governor in his letter, was the discussion of animal abuse. So that would be found within Title VI. It's Wyoming Statute 6.3, and then it's 1,000 essentially. That through that series, specifically where it discusses what is animal cruelty under Wyoming law. There's two separate, distinctions between misdemeanor and felony animal cruelty. And they include things such as knowingly overriding an animal, intentionally or knowingly injuring or beating an animal, carrying an animal in a manner that would, pose undue risk of injury or death. If a person has charge and custody of an animal, then it is important that they keep it under circumstances that would not manifest extreme indifference to the animal's safety, health, or life. You can't, maintain or keep fowls or dogs with the intent to engage in fighting of those animals. And those are just some of the examples there. Misdemeanor animal cruelty is punishable by up to 6 months imprisonment and a $750 fine. And it jumps up for any additional requirements, felony, any further violations of this statute. Felony animal cruelty is punishable by up to 2 years imprisonment and a fine of $5,000. And a person who's convicted of felony animal cruelty may also have the animal permanently forfeited from their possession. So that's just kind of the basic overview of what animal cruelty is in Wyoming. It is important to know that there are several exceptions to the animal abuse statutes. And there's different ways. It primarily relates to livestock. Rodeo events are accepted. The use of dogs in the management of livestock is accepted, as is hunting with dogs or raptors. And then importantly, and I'm just going to read this specifically, this is in Wyoming Statute 6.3, 1008. It's that the hunting, capture, killing, or destruction of any predatory animal, pest, or other wildlife in any manner that is not otherwise prohibited by law. So that's kind of jumping back to the discussion even within, such as Title 23, where, you can't go and violate any hunting regulation or anything of that nature, but, such as, that you're allowed to use a vehicle, a snowmobile, an airplane to, you generally are not allowed to do that for hunting wildlife, but it is allowed for predatory animals. So I think that's just kind of an important consideration. Within Title 11, there are animal damage management boards. I think they're just briefly addressed in Kelly's memo, just, provides for the recoupment of certain agricultural producers to be able to, if they are having depredation of their livestock or other reasons that there may be issues, then there's animal damage management boards, in each county that are to be maintained. They're overseen by a board. And so really that's just kind of the quick touch there. But I mean, I think it is important to consider, there are animal abuse statutes that do accept predatory animals. There's predatory animal provisions in Title 11 for agriculture. And then generally in Title 23 for game and fish, predatory animals, you can just take them at any time. The rules are fairly open for predatory animals in the state of Wyoming with, just following those exceptions for any wildlife that may be taken. So that's just kind of a quick run through. I'm happy to answer any additional questions or get into any more specific facts about Wyoming statute.
Questions from the committee? Comments? Thank you, Luke. So at this point, I think it might be helpful just to maybe go around the room on the committee and just kind of ask everybody to provide some thoughts on where they think we should go from here. And generally just start at the other end. Just to get a sense of what folks are thinking. And I might start with Director Nesbitt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I thought I would add just a little bit more context. LSO did a great job of providing a good, concise summary of the statutes that, you know, could be considered, I think, by this group as we discuss potential recommendations for the full committee. I think one thing that's important up front to recognize is that while predator management, wolf management, hunting, and cruelty statutes all were reviewed by LSO and are all have some overlap here, you know, this activity that gave rise to this working group and all of the public comment that you spoke about, Madam Chair, really, it was not hunting and it was not predator management. I think that's important for, you know, and certainly if folks disagree, be glad to hear that. But certainly from my assessment, this act that gave rise to this was neither of those. I think it's important to recognize that in Wyoming statute, the definition of take is very broad. And I think that as we have some discussions about if the discussion goes down the road of looking in Title 23, which are the game and fish statutes, the definition of take is going to be very important because it is so broad. I'll just read it to you because it's short, but I think you'll understand why I think we got to keep this in mind. Take means hunt, pursue, catch, capture, shoot, fish, seine, trap, kill, or possess, or attempt to hunt, pursue, catch, capture, shoot, fish, seine, trap, kill, or possess. So the act of take isn't actually just the killing of an animal. It means a whole lot of other things under Wyoming statute. You know, the things that I've heard most from the public and multiple discussions with all interest groups, hunting interest groups, ag interest groups, general members of the public, you know, really revolves around a few different ideas. One is certainly looking at penalties for the act of possessing live warm-blooded wildlife, which was the violation that ultimately was charged and resulted in a conviction in this case. Currently, that penalty, it falls under commission regulation, and it's considered a low misdemeanor under commission regulation. That maximum penalty is $1,000 fine and it's 6 months in jail. The other, it is important to note that those penalties are in statute. Those are not Game and Fish Commission regulations that determine penalties, and all penalties in any kind of a conviction are assessed by a judge, or in the case of a forfeitable citation similar to a speeding ticket, a lot of game and fish violations result in a citation being issued and a person can choose to either pay the fine or go to court. In those cases where they choose to, similar to a speeding ticket or traffic ticket, pay the fine, those fines are established by the Wyoming Supreme Court. Those are usually, they're almost always less than what the maximum penalties are. And the only way for the maximum penalties to be imposed is if a person is required to appear before a judge by the arresting officer or decides to appear before a judge because they wish to contest the violation. So that's certainly one area where I think this committee should at least give some consideration, is the actual penalties for the act of possessing wildlife that was charged in this case. Certainly, as was mentioned by also, the cruelty statute does have a potential nexus here. And I think that the committee needs to take a look at that and see if it might fit, or if there's ways to look at the cruelty statute. I also think that, you know, it's been brought up by several that some of the statutes under the ag title, looking at methods of take and those kind of things, are certainly things that have come up. But That's, my assessment of the options that have at least been discussed to this point. And I would certainly stand for any questions that anybody may have.
Thank you, Director Nesbitt. Any questions? Director Nesbitt, I realized on the agenda, we did have you also talking about wolf management more generally. Is that something you'd like to do now?
Yeah, I certainly can. I think that, again, Luke did a good job of providing some overview of what the statutes say about wolf management in Wyoming. We have a wolf management plan that focuses on those areas of the state where Game and Fish has authority to manage wolves, which is in the northwest corner of the state, in that area that's designated as the wolf trophy game management area. And then also there's a flex zone in there too. That's part of the year it's in the trophy game management area, and part of the year it's not. Our wolf management plan focuses only on that area, and because there's not suitable habitats outside of that area, there's not wolf management by the department that occurs outside of that area. This wolf management in Wyoming, it's unique for sure, as you heard from how wolf management's done in other states. We have established commission approved, public input informed, commission approved objectives for populations in that area where we manage wolves. And under the current regime in Wyoming, we've been able to meet or exceed those objectives for as long as they've been delisted and under the state's authority to manage. And just of note, I think it's important to note that those objectives are far above the minimum recovery criteria that are required by the federal government to delist. So currently that number is at least 100 wolves and 10 breeding pairs. And we've always managed for, the objective is 160 wolves and 12 breeding pairs. And we've exceeded those basically every year. Not basically, we have exceeded those or been within 10% of those every year that the state's had authority to manage wolves in Wyoming. So wolf management is certainly relative to the discussion because this involved a gray wolf, but this particular case did not occur in an area where the Game and Fish Department manages wolf populations. As was described by LSO, it was in the area where wolves are under Wyoming statutory definition of predatory animals that don't require licenses or don't have seasons. There is a requirement for those folks that take wolves in the area where they're defined as predatory animals to report the harvest within a certain amount of time. And we do monitor in those areas. We take DNA samples so that we can monitor genetic health of all wolves in Wyoming, but those are really the only requirements for wolves that are taken outside of the trophy game management area. I think that's a quick summary, Madam Chair. I'd certainly, again, be glad to answer questions.
Thank you, Director Nesbitt. I have a question just so where I believe you said that wolf habitat is not suitable outside of the trophy game area, but indeed we do know that obviously wolves do inhabit some of the predator management area. And so if Game and Fish doesn't manage in that area, is there any other entity that does, or just how does that work? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So in those areas, and the primary reason that it's not suitable habitat, many of those habitats have, places where wolves could exist, but because of human-dominated landscapes, wolves, in order to be viable and have healthy populations, have to be in places where there's not a lot of human activity. They don't coexist well with humans, and I don't mean that from any kind of a public safety standpoint, but from a conflict with other uses on the land. agricultural production is number one. They just don't coexist well in those places where there's human dominated landscapes. And that's why there's the biologically and socially, those areas in the northwest part of the state were identified decades ago as the suitable habitat in Wyoming. So outside of that area, you know, the authority to manage predatory animals in Wyoming falls under the Department of Agriculture. Typically, the way wolves are managed, you know, it's through predator management activities. A lot of that's executed by local predator management boards, and then also by livestock producers themselves, you know, on their own or with their neighbors. So those activities, since they're not regulated, they, you know, there's really any entity that has an interest or a stake that has the ability to manage wolves in that part of the state. I certainly would, if I've got some gaps here, would ask my friend from the Department of Ag to fill in any blanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Doug Miyamoto with the Department of Ag. Yeah, just to fill in some gaps. So in that predator zone, we have a couple different vehicles we use for wolf management in those areas. We typically have $100,000 that we use as part of our Animal Damage Management Board allocation of funds that we contract with APHIS Wildlife Services. In those instances where we have depredating wolves in livestock areas, that's the primary response that we use is through our partners at USDA, APHIS Wildlife Services, to take care of that problem. The other aspect of management for wolf take that we have in that predator zone is we have available a new allocation of money thanks to the legislature. That was a $300,000 allocation that is used for indemnification of livestock lost to wolves, and that we disseminate that by batching periods. Typically, we have 2 batching periods during the year where we collect statements of loss of livestock during 6-month time periods and then allocate to indemnify the loss. So that's a program that has been in fluctuating status with the listing and delisting status of wolves in Wyoming over the years. But I would say for the past 3 or 4 bienniums, we have had an indemnity program within the Department of Ag to help indemnify losses of livestock producers in that way. So those are the 2 primary programs that we use from a money standpoint for management. And then we obviously have all of our predator management efforts on top of that. But I would like to be clear and kind of reiterate what Director Nesvik already made statements towards, which is that this was an unfortunate incident from our standpoint, but didn't necessarily have anything to do with either agriculture or predator management. So that's in very short terms the role of the Department of Agriculture in wolf depredation. Happy to answer any questions that anybody has about that too.
Go ahead, Sandy. Thank you. Can you describe how the indemnification program works? So say I have 2 calves killed by wolves and in a non-trophy zone.
Yeah, so if you had 2 calves that were taken by wolves, the first thing we would do is we would go out and try to verify that and verify the reason for the kill and attribute that to wolves directly. We would document that, and then you could submit for reimbursement of a loss. And the way we would calculate that would be by taking the value of that livestock in the fall when you would typically sell those. So, you know, it would be more common to lose those calves earlier in the year, obviously prior to selling. And so we would extrapolate out the value of those calves to the fall of the year and indemnify on that basis. instead of, market value at the time of the loss or something along those lines. And what we do is we typically collect all of those applications for indemnification for a 6-month time period and put them all together, because almost always this funding has been first come, first served type of basis. There's always a limited pot of money. And so we would take all of the applications, and then we'd have a batching cutoff. We would figure out the value of all of those claims. And if we didn't have enough money, we would prorate them across all of the applicants for that time period. In recent years, that hasn't been a problem. It hasn't been an overprescribed program as of late. But what we have noticed over the years is that losses due to wolves are very, very cyclical. So we go through a number of years where we just don't see a lot of activity, and then we'll have a really heavy year where we get a lot of loss, wrong word, but we'll get a lot of loss in certain time periods, and it kind of ebbs and flows that way. Why? Not sure.
Madam Chair, if I may, real quick, just to follow up on Chairman Newsom's question, I failed to mention inside of that area where wolves are managed as trophy game animals. We certainly still have depredation issues with livestock, and similar to depredations by other trophy game animals, black bears, mountain lions, grizzly bears, we have a similar process where a livestock owner who's experienced loss can file a claim and then be compensated for those animals that were confirmed to be lost to gray wolves. We attempt our management plan and the season structure and the quotas that we set, we attempt to manage around that objective for wolves through the use of hunting. That's our primary tool. But oftentimes when there are depredations, we have to go in and do our own removal, our own management actions to alleviate damage to livestock. But our goal again is to minimize that, and then to primarily manage the population using hunting and quotas, seasons.
Madam Chair, Director Miyamoto, just some clarification, if I might. It's my understanding until recently, at least, that compensation in the predator zone was only available during those periods of time when the wolf had been relisted as an endangered species and therefore could not be managed as a predator.
That's correct, Jim. And that was why I made that qualifying statement. We've had varying status of the program over the years, and different sunset states or sunset dates have been applied to different pots of funding over the years. But it hasn't been very stable because of the Fish and Wildlife Service status of wolves as to how they could be managed.
And if I might add, Madam Chair, that's a careful decision that was made by the livestock industry when wolves were first reintroduced, is that we would forego compensation in any area where the wolf had the status of being a predator and could be removed whenever necessary, whenever desired.
Just to clarify, because I've been confused on that point myself. So when the animal is listed, there is not compensation in that area, or the other way around?
The other way around, when the animal is listed, because as a livestock producer, you don't have the ability to go out and remove animals because they're protected under ESA, then the legislature provided funding to the Department of Agriculture to provide compensation. And whenever they would be delisted, then that compensation would cease because the predator status returned.
Yes, and that did happen early on, but to be clear, right now, we do have a pot of money.
Say the last part again.
Right now, our program is active. And so if you have a loss that's incurred today, you're eligible for indemnification.
Director Nesbitt, did you have your hand up? Oh, Senator Guru, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, Brian, this may be for you or Doug. I don't know. You both may want to take a crack at it, but we talk and we've gotten a lot of input on this. And one of the questions I have is you talk about wolf management and the biology of this. And I just want to get it clear in my head. From your point of view, Mr. Director, either director, do the actions that occurred in Sublette County that brought this issue to the fore? I think it's been an issue for a long time. This incident just highlights it. But do those actions have any biological or wolf management implications in your view?
So, Madam Chair, I'll take a first crack at that, and thank you for the question, Senator Guru. And the short answer to your question is no. This was more about human behavior than it was any kind of impact on population management. And I would also add that we've never observed any kind of impacts on predator management activities that took place outside of the trophy game area having implications on our management inside the trophy game area. They're very separate, and predator control, predator management has not had any kind of an impact. And I think in this case, it's an important point that it's important as context and background to know some of the major components of wolf management in Wyoming and the biology, but that's not what's at stake here. This activity did not create a biological problem, and there's not other instances like this that create a biological problem for the management of wolves. I guess I'd stop there.
Madam Chair, can I follow up?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, okay. No, and I know that's your view on that, and I understand that. So take that, and then if that's true, and that's where, if we end up heading in that direction, is there merit in your view of exploring multiple options as we look at these statutes? Multiple options related to penalties for intentionally prolonging and suffering the life of an animal? And if so, and I don't want to put you too much on the spot, this is more thinking, because I know the chair was asking us all to kind of say how we're looking at this. So this kind of tips my hand a little bit. But you think that are there multiple options and related to penalties on this? And if so, where and what? And I know some people have some specific ideas. But as we go through this, Mr. Director, and Doug, this is you as well on the ag side. I want to make sure that you get a chance to weigh in as well. But to see where we can hit at this to get we want to try to change behavior. We all, I think everyone agrees, I would hope, or at least I'll just speak for myself, that what I'm trying to do here is change behavior about how this occurred, what it occurred, and make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think everybody that I've talked to in the sportsman community believes that that's where we kind of need to head with this, and believe in the ag community as well. So can you help me with that a little bit, or just some ideas? And like I say, I don't put you on the spot now. As we go through it, maybe you can highlight them as well, but I'll let you take it from there.
Madam Chair, I'll take a first crack at that, if I may. So I think, Senator Drew, to put a real pin, you're focusing in on what, from my perspective, is the issue that needs to be discussed, and that is specifically in this incident, what behavior needs to be addressed, and there were really two parts of this, I think, where folks had the most concern. One was after an animal was, quote unquote, under statutory definitions, taken, that it was allowed to be alive, and then its suffering was prolonged. I think that's one component of this that has to be addressed. And I think, secondly, this is certainly up for debate, but the other thing I've heard folks talk about is the actual method of take. I think that's more thorny. I think it's more complicated, but I do think that it's worth looking at, as you to use your words, looking at multiple options that address those two things, and that we stay focused on the incident that occurred in this particular case that gave rise to this committee, essentially. So thank you for the question. I'll ask Director Miyamoto if you might have other perspectives or other thoughts?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with Director Nesvik and Senator Guru as well. And in my initial thought was, you know, it's one of these unfortunate incidents that we have to address in some way. And so the first thought that came to mind was, well, penalty didn't seem to be sufficient. And maybe there's a way that we could increase the penalty and maybe even some discretion for that penalty as well. But prolonged suffering is certainly a concern as well. From my standpoint, agree wholeheartedly with the sentiments that have been stated earlier, and wanted to make sure that my role on this committee was to make sure that people understand this didn't have anything to do with agriculture. It also doesn't have anything to do with predator management. So there's an appropriate response to this, and you know, that was my initial thought in trying to deal with this, make sure that we can prevent it from happening again, and do that while still maintaining, you know, our appropriate and well thought out programs that we have here in the state of Wyoming that I think lead the nation when it comes to predator management programs. I'm very proud of the program that we run. Thank you.
And Jess, I'm going to call on you to just kind of respond to what you've heard to date and kind of where you think we need to focus our attention.
Madam Chair, I think from what I'm hearing is I'm sort of in the same boat where both directors are coming from, and that, you know, what we've heard is we know it's not hunting, we know it's not predator management, but it is human behavior. And there was been an allowance for that human behavior. I think some of the perspective that I've had is that when these statutes were written, we were in a very different time. You know, we had different technologies, we have different things. And so as cultures change, so must we. But looking at how we do that, because also, you know, the culture that we came from and where we're at has been incredibly successful in keeping the wolf on the ground, having wildlife in our state, having wonderful management for agriculture and everything else. So it has worked. So not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Where I have concerns, you know, I kind of see there's a couple different ways to approach this. As Director Nesvik and Director Miyamoto both talked about, sort of two issues to this. There was sort of how this animal came into possession or how it was taken, and then there was how it was treated after that. I think those are two separate discussions and likely two separate statutory changes that, should we choose to go after, I would say tying them together is probably not going to be helpful. The way that I've looked at it, though, is for the prolonged suffering part. You know, what is prolonged suffering? How do you define that? I look at it under the predatory statute of saying, you know, a quick death, fast, not prolonged. How we talk about that, I think there's some language that we can look at a little later. The other side of that is if we address that through the animal cruelty, and that's where some of my concerns lie, is within addressing this in the animal cruelty statute. I come from, you know, the school of hunting and trapping and everything like that. And to put wildlife underneath a statute that's mostly designed for domestic and livestock concerns me. I think we have wildlife statute that we address under 23, of which one of the predator statutes, 23.3.103, sits. Most people taking wildlife, of which predators are wildlife, are going to be looking to those statutes and looking to those laws and regulations rather than just the animal cruelty statute, although the animal cruelty one certainly is one that we're familiar with because of pets. And so blending wildlife and pets concerns me, because hunting and trapping is a short jump, and that animal cruelty discussion. And we don't want to set Wyoming up for that kind of argument. So what I'm looking at is under the predator statute, seems to make the most sense to me, but how we do that narrowly without infringing on agricultural practices is going to be really important. And I think if we're going to do it, the quick death clause should be under that statute. I think if we're going to look at how we take, what happened prior to that, how we take that, I think that's likely should go under a larger statute that addresses all wildlife. Because we do have some probably things that we can shore up in those statutes. I think that's a much different conversation that's going to take a lot more detail. We call wildlife, all wildlife, it's big game, small game, trophy game, predators, that all fits underneath there, as opposed to just going just for predatory and just doing the methods of take under there. I think if we're going to do it, we're going to look at the whole, but that's a different argument. And that's frankly going to be a bigger fight, I imagine. So I would say that looking at where we can do something and likely get something moved forward, it's going to be under the quick death. It's going to be under 23.3.103 is probably where the most comfortable part is. I've heard concerns with the animal cruelty stuff over and over and over again from hunters. So I know there's been concern there. And that's more in just mixing messages. Should we put wildlife under the same thing that we have domestic and livestock, or, they're not treated differently. It's the same, you can't torture either one of them, but should they be blended under management? And I tend to say that, animal cruelty is addressed usually by the sheriff's offices, and wildlife stuff is addressed by the game and fish and wardens who are much more probably used to dealing with wildlife, wild animal issues.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One element I forgot to mention in my initial remarks is one of these confounding variables as well. So just to be clear for the committee and everybody listening, the largest complaint that we got at the Department of Agriculture had to do with the commercial food license of the bar establishment, and wanting us to take regulatory action against that commercial food establishment for having a wolf in a bar. And so I'd like an opportunity to address that just real briefly about how we typically handle those types of cases. I was on a committee serving under Senator Guru last year about regulatory reduction, and a lot of focus of that had to do with commercial food establishments and other consumer health type of consumer service type protections that the department employs. And so when this incident came to light, there were a lot of calls to the Department of Agriculture for us to suspend the license of the bar to be able to operate. We didn't do that. What we did instead was handle this the same way that we would most public health conditions for a facility or a commercial food establishment like this, where we made personal contact and talked about the regulations for animals being in commercial food establishments, that being that they need to be service animals. Otherwise, they can't be anywhere near the food preparation areas, obviously. But we did talk about proximity to the kitchen, and just basically gave our general thesis on how to manage these type of incidents, and that please don't allow this to happen was kind of the message for us leaving. But this is not something where we would typically suspend a license. If it's something that's willful and repeated, it might be a discussion that we would have way down the line. But I don't think we've ever suspended anybody's commercial food establishment for pets in bars or something like that. It's one of those things where we talk about it a little bit. But I just wanted the committee to know that was the biggest push that we got, because it is under the scope of our regulatory purview as well. So just wanted to get that out there, but there are some confounding variables with all of this, and would like to acknowledge the thought that we would need to be very careful about how we go about this discussion of method. Thanks,
Director. Just for clarification, so does the statute say that you can't have a pet in a bar or a commercial food establishment?
Madam Chair, I would have to review the statute for the specific language, but it has to do with sanitary conditions around food preparation areas. And so generally speaking, it's one of those things where it may be, if you can segregate it enough, it might be something that, an outdoor area or something along those lines that wouldn't come under our regulatory purview. But generally speaking, you don't want animals in the proximity of food preparation areas.
Right, thank you. I asked Jim, I think there's a couple different, there's at least a couple ideas on how to approach at least the issue of prolonged suffering. And partly we're having a debate about where we would put that in the statute. And I think I think we've heard from Jess, I think Mr. McGagnon also has a concept of that. What I also think it's good for the public to hear, in that it is in the cruelty statutes, because that's where the predator exemption is. But this would be like essentially a limitation on that, on the predator exemption is maybe one way to think about it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would first offer that I would agree with virtually everything that Ms. Johnson said with regards to what the issue is. The issue is the mistreatment of a live animal. And in that respect, I think we need to be a little bit careful. And I've visited with a number of people who have used snowmobiles, for example, to deal with predators, particularly to remove predators in the wintertime when it's more feasible to do so in areas that later become lambing grounds or calving grounds, that now is when I can get out and do it. One of the points that's been brought to my attention, if you were to say, well, you can go out and shoot them, but you can't run over them with the snowmobile, just as an example. I may shoot at an animal and injure it, but not kill it, and that animal is left to suffer. If in a particular instance, I can kill that animal or run over it and immediately kill it, which I think should be required in the law, it may actually be a more humane treatment of the animal than just out there shooting and injuring animals and then not being able to trace them down to finish the process, as is required normally in good hunting management. So I think that's something to keep in mind. But certainly believe that there needs to be an increased penalty, and a penalty specifically for allowing an animal to suffer once you've injured it, if you have the ability reasonably to end the life of that animal. With regards to where it goes in the statute, I know we have one proposal that would put it in Title 23, the Game and Fish Statutes. Certainly don't see a problem with that. One of the reasons that I thought we should at least have discussion on the alternative of putting in the animal cruelty statutes is, one, as has already been explained by Director Nesvik, once an animal is classified as a predator, the Game and Fish basically doesn't have any jurisdiction. They don't rule over predators, where the Title VI or the animal cruelty statutes apply. A county sheriff could issue a citation. The county can prosecute on that basis. It may have a little broader ability there, provided we can sufficiently narrow it so it doesn't interfere with hunting and other types of practice. So I think that certainly is open for discussion. I put forward a proposal that would potentially put it in Title VI, but in either case, I think the key element that we need to address here is that if I, by whatever means, injure a predatory animal, then I have to make a good faith, reasonable effort to end the life of that animal, so I'm not just allowed to suffer. So certainly the most obvious thing here that the individual did was to get pleasure out of it afterwards and bring in and try to give others pleasure with it. But even short of that, having injured the animal, I think some reasonable steps to end the suffering of that animal at that point are something we're certainly believe should be given consideration.
I just want to make sure everyone on the committee has a chance to just kind of weigh in with their thoughts. So, so I'm gonna ask Senator Baldwin to do so.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I knew you were going to get to me. You just kept looking this way. A couple of things that I've thought about since this occurred. The first thing was a very selfish thing, is why the heck did this happen in my district? Correct. And then I got over that. But two things come to mind when I think about what could we have done differently that would have prevented this. And I think about some of my other things that involve the world that I live in. impaired driving comes to mind. We've got a lot of laws on the books about impaired driving. Have they made a difference? Some. Have they stopped the problem, or does it still occur? It still occurs all the time. People die all the time because of impaired driving, right? And I guess I thought about what could we do that would have changed this behavior? Because I truly think this is a human behavior issue as much as it's dealing with predatory animals. I don't believe it's a game and fish issue. I believe this is an issue of human behavior. And what could we have had on the books in the statutes that would have changed the behavior of this individual? And I honestly am not sure that there's anything. We're on thin ice when we start legislating about ethics and about morals, although I'll be honest, it happens all the time in the legislature. But it's thin ice. It's a difficult field that we tread on to legislate either of those things. And I could be wrong, and somebody here will probably be knowledgeable. I think it was Aldo Leopold that said ethics is what happens when nobody's watching. And I heard recently, there's not very many times that nobody's watching now. I'm willing to bet that everybody in this room and everybody online's got one of these things. They have a camera. They're everywhere. Not very many things happen anymore when no one's watching. And sometimes we forget that people are watching and things end up on Facebook, like the game and fish issue this last week that was successfully prosecuted because somebody shot a bull elk and put it on Facebook where they weren't supposed to. So it happens all the time. So I guess my thoughts go that way. This was an ethical failure. It was a failure of morals. And I don't think that addresses the person that did this. And that's a failure on the rest of those people that made death threats and all those things. And we can't fix that right now. There's laws about that. But I worry about that we put something on the books that's not enforceable, that's not going to make a difference. Is this going to happen again? I may not be alive when it happens again. It'll happen again, something like this or something different that's just as bad. What can we do to change that behavior and prevent it from happening again? Likely nothing, because there's lots of laws on the books, and in my editorial here, there's too many laws, and we try too much to enforce morals and ethics. But I think that there's something we can do to maybe correct a little bit of this behavior and show that we're concerned about it, because we are. I don't think there's anybody in the state, legislators, non-legislators included, that didn't look on this and say, oh my gosh, what was he thinking? You know, why the heck did this happen? I've heard lots of words, reprehensible, you name it. It's been described a number of different ways. It was unethical. It was unmoral. It was a bad deal. It shouldn't have happened, but how do we keep it from happening again? So I tend to think along with Director McGagner here, and that we probably need to put this in Chapter 6. That's my opinion. I don't think it's something that should fall under game and fish. They got plenty of moral and ethical issues to worry about on their own. But I think at the correct places to correct this and to do it the right way. I don't think we want to look at the way we manage predators. We've done it correctly for a long time. It's a difficult area to tread on. It's a difficult area to manage. And I think our game and fish and our Department of Agriculture have done a tremendous job. They don't always get credit for how good a job they do, as is witnessed by the number of emails that everybody in this group has gotten and everybody elsewhere has gotten. It's a very contentious issue, and I think these departments do a very fine job. So I think we need to avoid even treading into those areas. I think let's look at putting something in the management as far as the punishment or as far as the fines go. Would it have changed what happened in Sublette County? Probably not. I mean, that's just a failure of ethics. It's a failure of thinking. But can we maybe think down the road that it'll stop somebody? But I will tell you, I think that the incident itself will probably stop future events in the short term, because they're going to say, don't put this on Facebook. Don't take this wolf or this coyote or this whatever into wherever. Look what happened last time. And I don't think that individual, had he have known what was going to happen, you know, the threats to his family, the uproar it caused across the state, if he would have known that, maybe he wouldn't have done it. But those are my thoughts, Madam Chairman, and I've lingered too long, but now you won't look at me anymore. So thank you.
Probably won't get off the hook that well. Representative Winter, just wanted to get your thoughts as well, generally speaking.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. I apologize. My ears are not working very good today. I'm sorry. I can't figure out what's going on most of the time without them. So, um, I guess what I would just like to say is that, the state of Wyoming is having to deal with these predators, after the federal government, introduced them. And as far as I'm concerned, the wolf that is here today is an illegal wolf. The old timber wolf was still here when this new wolf was introduced, but nothing was done to try to reestablish the timber wolf that was already here. And as far as I'm concerned, it was an illegal act by the federal government. You can't introduce something that's going to affect what's going on already. So the state of Wyoming has had to deal with this from the get-go. And also the introduced wolf, this Canadian wolf, was put in at least a year ahead of time, because I know that for a fact. We had them at our hunting camp long before they were scheduled to be introduced. And so it's just been compounded by the federal government. I hate to keep mentioning this, but there's things that need to be understood in order to make good decisions. And so I bring it up for that reason. We talk about the damage that the wolf has done to livestock, and that's a big item. But more than that, this wolf has pretty much eliminated moose in the backcountry, at least around Yellowstone Park. And nobody seems to want to talk about that, but it's true. There are no moose left up there. And as a result, the rest of the country has been affected by no moose around. The willows are covering the trails, and it's just not, things are not working the way they have in the past. And I would hope that we could consider some of these things to make good decisions. And I agree with many of the other speakers that we need to be careful where we go with any new statutes or anything. I think the Game and Fish Department and the commission has been working very hard to do the best thing that they can for the wildlife, and also the Department of Agriculture. What they're doing for the ranching community is very commendable. And so I would hope that from here on out, we can use some of this information to make good decisions. So thank you.
Thank you, John. I'll just comment a little bit that while we're not here to litigate predator management, we're also probably not here today to litigate or relitigate the wolf introduction. So I think we'll just try to focus on the issues that I think the committee has identified. And I'm hearing three things at this point in time. One is addressing the prolonged suffering. One is looking at the penalties for live possession. And then the third, which is still, I think, a real challenge to talk about, but I think we should before we're done, is the question of the method of take, and if there's anything there that we feel that at least is worth looking into. Let me ask if there's anything else that we haven't identified that we think we should be talking about today.
Madam Chair, I just had a thought around the penalty about, looking at how, if we're addressing penalties with animals, making sure that we keep them in line with what the penalties are for the same act with a human. So domestic abuse, and making sure we're not putting a penalty so high for the beating of a wolf or a coyote that it is higher than if you were to do that with a human. And just making sure that we're cognizant. So I'm not sure what those abuses and what those penalties look like. And just as far as education wise, I'd want to make sure that we are keeping that in perspective as far as it goes within statute.
Madam Chair, with regards to penalty, and perhaps this is a question, I believe it was brought up by LSO or perhaps by Director Nesbitt, that the penalty today that Game and Fish has, if they were actually being applied by a judge, was the typical penalty for a misdemeanor, which is was $1,000, I believe, and I believe it even can include up to 30 days in prison. But the plea that the individual makes to settle this then gets a minor fine. That's something that probably is beyond the control of what this group deals with, but I think that's something needs to be given some thought. The higher we raise the penalties, are we just encouraging people more to accept their guilt and pay a lesser fee as opposed to paying what they should be paying for the act they've created? And I just raise that to keep in our minds if we start to really discuss increasing penalties beyond what are the typical penalties in our law today for misdemeanors for first offense and higher penalties for subsequent offenses.
Just to make sure I'm tracking this concept. So misdemeanor, you can plea, you can just take the citation and pay the fee that then is set in at the regulatory level. Is that correct, Director Nesbitt? Versus if you were to go to court to fight it, then you're subject to the possibility of a higher of the maximum fee. Is that correct?
So, Madam Chair, there's actually a point at which a warden has discretion to require the person to appear in court or to make it forfeitable. So if the arresting officer says, no, this is forfeitable, yeah, then the decision is in the defendant's hands to just pay it or go to court. However, if they're required to appear in court, then they would have to. And the penalties, Mr. McGagnon was correct on penalties with one exception. The low misdemeanor in Wyoming does allow for $1,000 fine and then up to 6 months in jail. And then this isn't listed in the penalty statute, but judges can also order, and they often do in wildlife cases, they'll order restitution to defendants to pay for costs incurred by either a victim or the state of Wyoming.
So just to connect these ideas, perhaps, were we to put language into Title VI along the lines of what Jim has suggested, that then would put this in animal cruelty, and then that would allow for a penalty or misdemeanor under 6 for the prolonged suffering. That would be different and not subject to the warden's discretion.
Madam Chair,
Does that make
that's
sense
correct.
to folks?
That's correct. If this was placed in Title VI, Game and Fish would not be enforcing it. We enforce Title 23, Title 41, and then a handful of other statutes, but for most part, we don't enforce Title VI. And so that would be, and typically in most of those Title VI crimes, like, and cruelty to animals is one, oftentimes those are handled and charged in a different way. Rather than a deputy sheriff, writing a ticket, oftentimes they work through a whole different process where a person is required to appear in court.
Thank you, Director. I'm just looking at the clock. I think we scheduled a break around 10, and maybe we'll just take a break right now for about 10 minutes and then regroup and figure out what we want to do next. So we'll be back up at the top of the hour. Let's go back live, please. Second. So we got this all solved over the break. uh, Director Nesvik, just again for, I don't know whether a poaching incident is a good example, but just for the public to understand where you go from a game and fish violation, and then how does that end up in the courts, and what that process is, and what that might look like for other wildlife violations.
Sure,
So we
absolutely.
understand that process.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And just a quick logistical note. So I've got to head for Gillette with the governor here in like 20 minutes. And so I'll be stepping out of the meeting, but I will have the chief game warden on, and Heather, I've sent him the link. And so if he joins, if you would admit him as somebody who's able to speak, I would appreciate it. And he'll stay here until you're done to answer any other questions. But essentially how that works is, and it's not different from other misdemeanor violations that are enforced by other law enforcement officers in the state. Essentially, when a warden identifies that a crime has been committed, develops probable cause, they've got a couple of different options. The most common, by far the most common option that is exercised is, most of our violations are they're not significant crimes, and a warden makes a decision to issue a citation. And most of the time, those citations are forfeitable, meaning that a person can make a choice as to whether to pay the fine that the warden writes on the ticket. That amount is established by the Supreme Court, or that individual has the opportunity to go to court and say, no, I plead not guilty, and I want to have a trial, and I want to contest this violation. The other much lesser common occurrence is that it's a more serious violation, or it's a repeat offense. And in the warden's discretion, the forfeitable amount set by the Supreme Court is not necessarily going to be adequate, and that the warden believes that the defendant should go see the judge. And in that case, the warden, when they issue the citation, they make the citation must appear, meaning that the individual has to go appear before the judge. In even lesser circumstances, more serious violation, somewhat like an example of poaching a big mule deer out on the winter range without a license and out of season. That's a pretty significant crime with extreme extremely high penalties. And in those cases, which are again more rare, oftentimes the warden will make a decision to arrest the defendant, take him to jail, make him post a bond, and then go to court later. There's one other scenario. Again, it's not common, but oftentimes our wardens will do longer term investigations, and rather than issuing citations, they'll work through the local prosecutor in the court to issue to file an information and an affidavit, and then they're charged and served by the local sheriff and directed to appear in court at a certain time, and they're provided a charging document that's not a citation. It's issued directly by the county prosecutor's office. So I hope that answers your question, but that's kind of the summary of the 4 different ways that a person that's believed to be guilty of a wildlife crime can be charged.
Madam Chair, Director Nesbitt, would you clarify for us, please, in the case we're talking about, the wolf case in Daniel, did the warden have the option under the current law that he could have required that individual to appear in court?
Madam Chair, Mr. McGagnet, yes, the warden in this case could have done that and decided not to.
Thank you, Director Nesbitt. That's really helpful. So again, that's set within the regulations of the Game and Fish Department to have that discretion, correct?
Madam Chair, no, that's actually the rules of criminal procedure in Wyoming. That's not a Game and Fish thing. That applies to all law enforcement officers across the state.
And so is there, just for education purposes, is when a warden issues a citation that they must appear, again, that's discretion in terms of a repeat offense?
Correct. But that's just one consideration. Wardens consider, again, the seriousness of the crime, the repeat offense, and if the warden in their judgment, based on what they know, believes that issuing a forfeitable citation will achieve their objective, which is enforcing those laws. And so they do have quite a bit of discretion. However, I will say that they kind of have they establish their own set of rules too, as far as when it makes sense for somebody to have to go before a judge. I mean, it's fairly common that if somebody's a repeat offender, they're going to go before the judge, or if there's some egregious aggravating circumstance in the warden's judgment, they always have that discretion to make them go before the judge. And they oftentimes, there's kind of some norms that have been established over many years is when those things happen.
All right, thank you. So so we have a couple ideas in front of us in terms of just the question of addressing prolonged suffering. And to try to summarize, one is in 23, one is in under 23.3.103, and the other is in 6.3.102. I think for me, they both have validity. And I'm not at this point ready to say one is better than the other, but I just want to hear from the rest of the committee any thoughts on whether we want to move forward with those ideas and flesh them out a bit more in the interim, or whether you have other thoughts on addressing the question of suffering of the animal.
Madam Chair, if I can give a little perspective maybe on, I brought the 23.3.103 forward, and why I went there, I think I talked a little bit about earlier, but sort of on further reflection, some of the reasoning And forgive me, Director Nesvik, I am loath to put more on your warden. But in this particular instance, it was the warden that was called. And it is what people are used to calling for instances with wildlife in particular. It's not what they're used to calling with livestock and domestic animals. But as far as, you know, a trained public in reporting things like this or behavior like this, and as far as who is actually out there on the ground, it is the wardens. They are out there and they're in these places. This is not happening on trails. This isn't happening on roads very often either. This is happening out where the wardens are, and where there are regulatory eyes in that sense. And, you know, man, I feel like I spend a lot of time sitting in front of the legislators telling you guys not to do anything with the wardens. But in this particular instance, it is the game and fish who have mostly the eyes on the grounds in these areas and are a little more used to wildlife calls, of which predatory animals are wildlife still in our statute. And, you know, maybe there's places, I'm not going to throw a red flag in this either way this goes. I think this needs to be addressed one statute or another, but I can tell you that the reasoning that I brought it forward in 23 was because of the knowledge behind the people that are likely going to be getting the phone call for this kind of behavior. And that, you know, this was not hunting, this was not predatory management, but it is wildlife. And we do have an agency that's a little more adept at the wildlife calls. Not that I think Game and Fish needs to be in oversight of all predatory animal things, but in this sort of violation in particular, it does seem to make sense. Thinking about where these will happen, and how most people in the state are trained to report such violation or behavior, it's not usually the sheriff that gets the first phone call. But that being said, I want to say that I do think both have merit, so it's worth a discussion. I'm really open-minded on either approach. And then to give maybe some description into the language, the choice of language was very intentional here. The word possession actually comes from a Chapter 10 definition that talks about physical dominion or control over wildlife regardless of ownership. It includes constructive possession, where a person knowingly holds the power and the ability to exercise dominion and control over wildlife and has the ability to reduce the wildlife to actual possession. So that's not, it's hands-on, but it's also like, if you run this over and it's fatally injured and can't do anything, you have possession over that. The other language, you know, obviously the shall, important. But promptly killed and released, actually, or released, is pulled from another game and fish statute around lion hunting. Promptly was very intentional because it gives the idea that you have a little bit of time of discretion to make a choice. You know, immediate, I think we can get into too sticky of language, whereas promptly, you know, maybe you do run it over and you need a follow-up shot, or maybe you shoot it and it's wounded. And you have to make a follow-up shot. Like that's prompt. You know, you got to give folks a little bit of time to make the right decision there. But that is also pulled from a game and fish statute. So the language there was very intentional. And, you know, hoping to give enough that where there can be some discretion and some intent talked about, but not so much as where we are penalizing people that are just trying to do agricultural maintenance.
If I might ask the question, is there a definition in what you're referencing for released? In other words, if I seriously injure the animal and just take off and allow it to lie there and suffer, have I released it?
So I think that's what needs to be fleshed out. And originally in here, I just had promptly killed. Promptly killed or released is specific to the lion statute because, you know, a lot of folks treat lions and decide it's not the one to take and let it go. This is a different thing. So I think released is very much open to some discussion. But that is really the sticking point, because I think, you know, there is there is discretion in that and we should have that talk because no, as far as I know, the released is talking as far as lion kill. And I don't think that makes sense particularly here, but I wanted to make sure I had that language in there. So we had the discussion about what it looked like.
Would it work to add in the language, any predatory animal or predaceous bird intentionally taken into possession and injured shall be promptly killed, and just leave off the released part? Or would that work? As it's not dissimilar to the language in 6.
I think I would lean on Director Nesbitt on if that would work still and how that would filter out possession and injured shall be promptly killed. Is that language too narrow?
I think that if you were going to go down that road, you'd want to put injured right after intentionally. So any predatory animal or predaceous bird intentionally injured and taken into possession. That doesn't address Mr. McGagne's question. But I don't think you want to have possession and injured. I think you got to say that they've injured. It has to be injured and or in possession.
I think that and or in possession may work. And Director, is there a reason to keep released in there?
No. Because this, if it was all under the definition of take, in theory, you could take an animal if you captured it without injuring it. And then I would say, yes, it would, but that's not contemplated in this language.
It is earlier in the statute, though. It says predatory animals and predaceous birds may be taken without a license in any manner. I mean, is taken considered that same?
Yeah, I think in this context, taken wouldn't fall under the statutory definition because the statutory definition is strictly take without the "and" on the end.
We may have
What
just
you're
found that.
referring to in this language is what you're referring to here is an act of that's different than take. It's somebody that's taking an animal into possession rather than.
So I'm saying in the
Like-
current statute, though, it does use the word taken. So is that not the statutory taken?
Maybe taken. Well, I can tell you this, I don't know if it is, but that's what the intent here is. So that's a
Yeah.
good point. I think you're using the same exact language, but it's in a different context.
I'm fine with
Because-
scratching that. Please.
Take
Oh.
includes possess. So you're saying the same thing twice. It's essentially you're saying intentionally possessed into possession because the definition of take includes possess. So we have to think about this.
And we added possession because it does exclude trapping, and that was the concern with taken.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering if the language goes, any predatory animal or predaceous bird intentionally injured and in the possession or
In the possession of.
taking out the word taken, so we don't get into that. So in some way, making clear that the animal is in the possession without using the word taken,
Yeah.
taken into possession.
Intentionally injured and in
And
possession.
in possession. Does that pass muster, Director Nesbitt?
Well, then I'm wondering if should be something along the lines of make reasonable efforts to promptly kill because you intentionally injure, and I'm thinking of somebody that's doing, out trying to do predator management, and they intentionally injure predatory animal. And before they can promptly kill it, it becomes, it goes and crawls in a hole and it's not available. So should it be something like a person who intentionally injures, and takes into possession, intentionally injures or takes into possession, shall make all reasonable efforts to promptly kill the animal.
Madam Chair, just for discussion purposes at least, what if we were to take the language in the other proposal for 631002 and basically put that first sentence of that language into 233103? So it's any person who intentionally directly injures or disables a predator animal by use of a vehicle, etc., shall immediately make a good faith effort to euthanize or to kill, we could change the word, the injured or disabled predatory animal. Would that fit in 23?
I think so, but I would ask the expert.
I kind of like that. I would want to look at it on paper, but I kind of like that. I think that my first blush at that is that it would.
So we would essentially take that first sentence from Jim's take at 631002 and put that. So I think that does read white.
I'm wondering if it might make sense, because then 233103A has got that language about reporting, etc. Would it make more sense to take the first sentence of the B in 6 and put it as a subsection B in 23103 and then renumber B and C as C and D? So it stands alone.
Yeah. And that will still, violation of that still falls under a low misdemeanor in this statute. But we'd have to add in C, we would have to add. So if you made a subsection B, you can reference it in C that makes it a low misdemeanor.
Jim, can you say that language one more time?
Violation. You change it to in violation of subsection B.
B, yeah, that's
Instead
what I'm
of-
saying.
yeah.
Yeah, so you'd be adding in the first sentence of this, making a B subsection, and then you'd have C and D and change. So you're just adding a subsection.
Right.
Okay,
Just-
I like that.
Right. And C becomes D, and then the language that you added in violation of subsection A or B,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
In this section. All right,
do you want me to read it, Director, how that would read?
That'd be great. And then Senator Drew has his hand up too.
oh. Senator Guru, do you have a comment you want to make?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I did have a question, and maybe Jesse, just before you read the whole thing out, I want to make sure that I have it straight because I'm looking at the statute here. In your, what would become D, or C as it's written in yours, the low misdemeanor, the fine and what you're anticipating there is what I see in this section is up to $1,000 fine in 6 months, up to 1,000, which may be added to up to 6 months in prison for each offense, or up to 6 months. So is that what you had in mind there? Am I reading that right?
Yes, I mean, I think that was what I had when I put it in there, mainly because I wasn't quite cognizant of what other low misdemeanors might be. So I'm not set on that in any way. It was for discussion's sake, yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Jesse.
Madam Chair, would you like me to read this or? So we have 233103, Section A would read as it does, predatory animals and predaceous birds may be taken without a license in any manner at any time, except as provided by, and it would have the list out. Then what we would add is a subsection B to this that would read, any person who intentionally directly injures or disables a predatory animal by use of a vehicle, snowmobile, or other ground-based mobile device shall immediately make a good faith effort to kill the injured or disabled predatory animal. That would be subsection B. Then you would go and you would change B to C. That would be the areas designated by the commission. Specified trophy game animals may be taken in the same manner as predatory animals without a license. That's a different exemption. And then C would turn to D. And then that would read, any person who takes any fur-bearing animal or game bird without appropriate license, or who takes any predatory animal in violation of subsection B of this section is guilty of a low misdemeanor.
Thank you.
I like how that reads, but I.
Director Mayamoto.
Thank you. I like this attempt. I would ask that I'd be given a chance to take this to my partners at USDA, APHIS Wildlife Services, have them and the predator management professional at the Department of Ag take a look at it. And I can get back to you with any specific recommendations that they have, but on first blush.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, I got to run now, but I would like the same, I kind of like this too, but I would like the same opportunity to have my staff give this a good scrub and to find any potential problems with it that are we just can't see right now. But my initial read on this is positive.
Thank you, Director Nesbitt. It is the intention of this committee to put this in draft form and not make a recommendation until we've heard back from both the public and agencies that we feel good about the language, and would do that later this summer.
So, Madam Chair, and maybe this is for the chairman of TRW. So is this at all being addressed at the July meeting?
We have on the agenda a brief reporting, but we're not expecting a finished product.
Okay, thank you. Handing you
All right,
off to
sorry,
Chief
well-
King.
Sorry, what was that, Brian?
I'm handing you off to Chief King. He'll be with you to answer
right.
questions. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Director. Safe travels. So at the meeting in July at TRW, we can report out on what our recommendations are and get some feedback from the committee too if we want. But we're not going to have a final recommendation until later in the summer.
So I'm wondering, as we talk about this, is specific to use of vehicles, does it need to be broader than that?
It does kind of sound like we are promoting and maybe encouraging take with a vehicle, just as it reads. I don't think that's the intent at all. Obviously, it's the exact opposite of that, but I am wondering, because we focus on that, it doesn't quite cover other behavior.
Madam Chair, the reason for that choice of language, and I drafted that part, was one, we don't want to engage here with the aerial removal of predators. So we needed to leave that out. And the other is we don't want to get into the arena of trapping, so it has to be related to vehicles. And so there may be a better choice of words there, but a ground-based vehicle seem we might just want to say a ground-based mobile device and leave out the specific word vehicle and snowmobile. That would be one way to do it and keep it more generally.
I would agree that keeping it general is probably better, especially in, I think about work done around hunting and means of take. And when we get into the laundry list of what technology might look like 50 years down the road, rather than continually having to modify it, maybe a general ground-based vehicle gets at the intent
And
of
I'm
that.
assuming that excuse me for interrupting here. You said we might be a little less formal, Madam Chair, but I assuming that even though a snow machine travels on top of snow, it's still deemed a ground-based vehicle, so.
So if we just said any person who intentionally directly injures or disables a predatory animal by use of a ground-based vehicle, does that cover what we want to cover, but not what we don't want to?
Vehicle, yeah. Mhm.
Okay. I feel like we've got this pretty close. Luke, do you feel like you've tracked the conversation well enough?
Yes, I believe so, Madam Chair.
Thank you. All right, so go ahead.
Madam Chair, I just had a question for Director Miyamoto as this comes through, making sure that we're not like impeding on the wildlife services stuff with the vehicle. And that's my main concern of like listing out the vehicle stuff, and that'll be fleshed out with your crew, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's my intention to contact them directly. You know, we have a predator management coordinator at the Department of Agriculture. Obviously want to run that through that division, but they have everyday interactions with their counterparts at USDA, APHIS. I don't see there's nothing that comes to mind as problematic at first blush, but I want to get into the specifics of their program with them. So if it does impede anything, we would know it. I can identify it for you, but I don't see anything.
So I have a question. So because this would be in the wildlife statutes, would it impact the ability of contract hunters or that sort of thing to do their job?
Madam Chair, Representative New, I don't believe so. No, they have to comply with the existing laws and regulations anyway as part of their contractual obligation. All state laws.
All right. So I'm assuming, are there any objections from anyone on the committee to moving forward with this draft legislation to consider at a later date? Hearing none, I'll request that LSO make this one of the ones, and then we'll publish it on the website as a possible draft change. So, by doing this, have we addressed the penalty issue in any way? And if not, is there a way that anyone thinks that there is a way to do so? The question of increasing penalties, or are our hands somewhat tied in that arena? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Madam Chair, we did, in moving that subsection down, there is a part of that last subsection in this that talks about making it a low misdemeanor. And that is an increase from what they were, and this is a completely different thing, obviously, to what they were able to fine the previous incident. This would give a low misdemeanor to a violation of this, which is that $1,000 or up to 6 months in jail. And that as written, and I'm certainly open, I think that was a placeholder, and I think I've heard other thoughts thrown around, but not knowing, I don't know the domestic violence statutes very well in this state, so I wouldn't want to I know the wildlife ones really well, but not the other ones, and just making sure that we're kind of in line with that.
Madam Chair, a question I would have had for Director Nesvik, and I don't see Mr. King on there yet at this time, but would be, as I understand the way he explained, in this particular incident that's driven all this, that the warden had discretion. He could have required the individual to appear in court, which would have made him subject to these penalties. And that's not, that discretion is not something we want in statute, but can the department, for example, provide some recommendations to their wardens that if it appears that the person that did this was doing it to get pleasure out of it or something like that, a circumstance similar to this, that they should not exercise that discretion to allow them to pay a $250 fine and avoid a court appearance. And I said,
Senator Guru?
Well, I don't want to interrupt Mr. McAgnus' question, but I do have one when he gets an answer to his question. So I'll hold until he's finished.
that answer may not be forthcoming till we get someone from Game and Fish involved, but
That
Okay.
was
well-
also my understanding, though.
Well, I would never presume to answer for Game and Fish, but I can tell you from an agency standpoint that this event alone probably did change the viewpoint of game wardens and how they might handle a citation from this point going forward. It certainly would for any of our inspectors. So just generally speaking, I think job done on that front.
And just for clarity's purposes, and I am not on the Judiciary Committee and am not particularly familiar with these statutes, that would this add a separate misdemeanor then to the live possession, right? That was cited previously in the incident.
No, I think because we're not talking that statute, this is not touching that statute. It's a different, that was possession of live wildlife. This is another predatory statute, so it's under a different statute.
Right, but had the same behavior taken place and the warden gone in, then
This
he
would have
could
come.
cite both of them,
Yes,
is what I'm saying.
yes,
He could do that.
he could double up, yeah. I think the term is throw the book at him.
he would cite both of them. Now,
Right,
might be unlikely that the court is going to double the penalty based on that, but he could certainly citation for both, and then they could be found guilty of one or the other or both.
And Madam Chair, I do believe that Chief King is online. We're just trying to see if we can get him up on to the video here.
thank you, Luke. Why don't you go ahead with your question, Senator Guru?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I too have seen Chief King kind of come on and come off, so I don't don't see him at the moment. But my question was, and I like where we're going with this draft in 23-3103. That's great. I was wondering, and I didn't want to get ahead of it, but I want to know if the group thought there was any need to go ahead with Mr. McAgnus' draft as well in the predator statute, just as another piece. We may not keep it in the end, but personally, I'd like to see us write this up in the predator side as well. Like I say, only so if Mr. Miyamoto, Director Miyamoto comes back and has some issues that maybe from the ag side that maybe we might want to still keep that as a draft just in case. I just want to hear what the group thinks about that.
I'm certainly amenable to that idea because I feel like moving forward with both of these, at least we can kind of workshop them over the next couple of months and make sure that we can weigh both of them and see which one makes the most sense, or whether there's a reason to do both of them. It's not clear to me at this point in time that there is, but I do think addressing the predator exemption in the cruelty statutes in some way that at least modifies that is certainly something that we've heard from the public. That there's a keen interest in that. Chief King, are you with us?
Good morning, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll take a crack at answering Mr. McGagna's question. So in regards to the penalty, like Director Nesbitt explained, game wardens have the discretion to either make a citation forfeitable or must appear. If they write the citation to be a must appear citation, that means the defendant has to appear in court. And if they're found guilty, then the judge can use his discretion in setting a penalty, both a fine and potential jail term. And then the judge has the latitude that's in the penalty statute to go up to $1,000 and up to 6 months in jail for a low misdemeanor. If an officer writes a citation and makes it forfeitable, meaning that the defendant can just go in and pay the fine and be done with it, we rely on the uniform bail and bond schedule, which is set by the Supreme Court. And so that's kind of that's the guidance that officers have for the fine that would be paid for a forfeitable offense. And so there's an avenue there to go to the state Supreme Court and make a recommendation to say that this particular violation should be a fine of X if it's going to be forfeitable, and make that recommendation to the Uniform Bail and Bond Committee. So that's one avenue to influence what the fine would be if it's forfeitable.
Madam Chair, question. This may be not appropriate for Mr. King, but I'll ask it anyway. If the officer who investigates or finds this offense is not a game and fish official, but it's a county sheriff, say, it'd be my understanding the sheriff can still issue citations under Title 23. Would they have this, to your knowledge, would they have the same discretion that the game and fish warden has in terms of whether to require a court appearance or accept that court established payment?
Yes, Mr. McGagna, they would. Same exact discretion. They could handle it same way our officers would, either with a citation that could be a forfeitable bond or fine amount, or require the defendant to appear in court.
So if we are going to address this in both 23 and 6, the penalties are different as described in these statutes that assign penalties. So if we're going to address them in both places, I think we have to adjust the penalty statutes to make them the same. So whether you're charged under Chapter 6 or under Chapter 23, the penalty phase is the same.
Right, and the difference for the low misdemeanor is $750 versus $1,000. Is that that's the way? Right.
This is 1,000.
Up to $1,000 and up to 6 months.
So the change would be to change the 750 to 1,000, or the other way around, either one.
So I would change 63104A or 1004A to $1,000 and leave the 6 months, because the 6 months is consistent in the game and fish in Title 23. And then we're consistent no matter which way somebody chooses to charge them, the penalties are consistent.
And my recollection is that in other places in our statutes in recent years, we've seen those same adjustments being made simply to keep up with the times, where we've increased some of those fines that have been at 750 for many, many years.
Director Maimo.
Just a quick question. Under the penalty provisions of 236202, is that up to $1,000 or 6 months and include the provision of both? Or is it either or?
Sorry, which one were you talking?
This was 236202. A5. I just
Right,
wanted
so-
to make sure everything conforms.
Yeah.
So it reads up to $1,000, to which may be added imprisonment up to 6 months when the offense is a low misdemeanor. So it's at the judge's discretion, right? Which, okay. All right, any other thoughts on the addressing the prolonged suffering of an animal under these circumstances? All right, well, I think we've done well here. Let's plan to move forward with both those proposed draft changes for both Title VI and Title 23. I think perhaps the harder issue that we've had a lot of conversation about is the method of take. And certainly we've heard from the public that just the act of running over an animal, which often, if I think we recognize isn't always, it's not an instantaneous action necessarily of killing the animal. We've certainly seen where in some cases the animal is injured in that process. And we've had lots of calls to just outlaw that effort. But we also recognize that this is a tool that agriculture uses. And as Jim Magagna spoke of earlier, it is a way to actually perhaps more humanely dispatch an animal than would be trying to shoot it while it was running. So I think at least for me personally, then the question is the issue of allowing a take for essentially recreational purposes, for amusement purposes, that does not, as Director Nesvik said, have a biological need necessarily, since we're not out there trying to eliminate all predators. That's not what our predator management is about. This really is for other purposes. And I think the question is whether we might be able to discriminate between the intent of those actions, even if the actions look very much the same, and whether that's something we want to at least attempt to address through statute.
Just off the cuff, I would say, I think we should try this first. See if it achieves the objective, and if it does, then that's good. And it's conversation that swirls around consistently anyway, but I would rather take smaller bites in the beginning and see if we can address it.
So what you're saying, Doug, is you're comfortable going forward with what we've just discussed, but not that concept.
That's correct. It's tricky business to start to try to discriminate objectives amongst the public, and I don't want to get in a situation where, we have agriculture over here in this room. It's not something that I would prefer to do.
Other thoughts?
I would just add to that experience I've had where I will at times get calls from someone who said, you have people who are having particular problems with, most often coyotes, but it could be wolves as well, out with their livestock. I'd be happy to go out and hunt coyotes for them. Well, for the rancher that's having the problem, it's clearly an agricultural issue. For that person who's calling and volunteering to go kill coyotes, it may be for a recreational purpose. And so I think it can become very complex when you try and draw those lines between the person that's benefiting from it. I mean, they're both benefiting. One's benefiting protecting their agricultural production. The other one is benefiting from recreational or a hunting use that they appreciate and want to engage in.
I think it becomes sticky, and I think if Fred and I had that hour or 2 or 10 hours that we've spent on the House floor and the Senate floor discussing knowingly, I think that we're back in that realm of knowingly. And that's a tough nut to crack. So I think I agree with Director Miyamoto that we would be better off to go this step and see how it goes, see if we can get something through the legislature at this point. If we ask for a lot of different things, I think that we watered down maybe getting anything.
Madam Chair. I would add to that, and I think, and this is my opinion only, is that we need to keep it narrow where we've already gone, the amendment we talked about, and that this is but probably not suited to a committee bill. The discussion that we're currently having, I think this fits better if somebody is so desirous to bring it, which has been brought. We've talked about this very subject a number of times, as Chairman Duncan has talked about, and that is, I think it's better brought as an individual bill if it's so desired, but I think that we need to focus on what we're at right now. If we get this through and everybody's happy with it, then great, and the committee desires to move on to that down the road. But I think at this point, what we've already proposed fits better into our directives and the purpose that we have here. And I think once we start talking about this additional piece, we're straying outside of our purpose. That's just my thoughts.
Madam Chair, I think I'd echo a lot of the sentiments there, especially in the interest of knowing how easy it is to get bills through a legislature. That you know, we have a full consensus sitting here with one, and there is going to be discussion. I'm certain there'll probably be other bills that come forward, individual bills. I do think that's the place for sort of the method of take discussion. What led me to that feeling though, because as a hunter, that doesn't necessarily sit well with me, that method of take, but I do understand the need for it in the agricultural side of stuff. And what I went back to is looking at this incident, what was the real problem here? And it was that the animal didn't die quickly. And while I am uncomfortable with running an animal over intentionally, they die quickly, I'm still okay in that sense of like, it's about, this is where we get into the stickiness of ethics. Is ethics how fast it dies, or is ethics how it dies? Because if the how is quick, is that still ethical? And that's where I worry about legislating ethics. Now I know what I'm comfortable with and not comfortable with, and what happens when, what is ethical is not always legal, and what is legal is not always ethical. And looking at how we, and what we may and may not inadvertently incentivize in behavior, I think is worth the discussion from maybe a different individual bill being brought forward. But what the main meat of this incident was what happened after this animal was run over. Had it died quickly and never made it to Facebook, we would not be sitting here. So maybe there's a silver lining in that we're having to address maybe some loopholes that we've had in this statute. But also I want to stick to the narrowness of what we're here to address. And it was the reprehensible behavior that came after. And I think what we have gets at that. How we look at ethics later on, again, I'm always nervous about it in statute, but we put our best foot forward in that. And I think there's discussions to be had that are worth having, but maybe through an individual bill.
Chief King or Senator Guru, any other comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do understand. I understand the reason for the question. And I also know that a lot of folks watching this and the folks who've written this are going to take a look at the potential work product here, and they're going to think that it's somewhat wanting. I understand based on the calls I've had and the letters I've had, and I'm sure you've all gotten them too, but some people are, in some minds, are going to be frustrated by this. Those of us who know the process and know the legislative process and know kind of some of the nuances of what we're dealing with here, I agree. I think that we need to take smaller steps. I think there's some other things we can look at. I also think a robust discussion on taking and all that should occur, but not here and not with this, because it does jeopardize the fundamental goal here is to try to change behavior and stop this right in its tracks. And I think we're getting closer. I think there's still other things we can do. Maybe we explore that offline as we move forward. But I agree. I think that starting us more narrow, but having two drafts, one in cruelty and one in the game and fish statutes, I think is smart. So as we move forward, we can be nimble to try to get at this. So that part I agree with, and I think we should keep exploring on this changing behavior. Thinking, and it's something that Senator Baldwin says, and boy, we sure going to miss him as he retires. But I think that there is some correlation here about drunk driving statutes and things. Sometimes there might be another way to get at this where we say, okay, this is the law. Well, then maybe we could talk to our friends at the Game and Fish and talk about other ways to say, well, if you're convicted of this, that may trigger another action with loss of privileges. And that would be run through rule in Game and Fish that may have a positive effect once again on changing behavior, because frankly, fining and threatening of jail time is one thing, but we all know how that works through the process of the courts, and that maybe there might be another way, like just like in let's say in drunk driving cases where you lose your license automatically, you lose your privilege to drive. That is, that affects the behavior. And usually if you talk to people who've been involved, sometimes that's the biggest stick of all. So maybe thinking about it in those terms as we move forward might have some fruit to bear. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Chief King, do you have anything else to add to this conversation?
Madam Chair, thank you. I think Senator Grew summed it up well, and I would agree that starting narrowly to begin with is a good idea.
Thank you. So it's a little after 11. Is there anything else that anyone on the committee believes we want to bring forward or discuss further? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.